Well, welcome to Midweek in the City. We are back. We are doing our revlog version again where we're on Zoom, but I'm glad y'all are joining us tonight. And so I'm really excited about what we have this week. So we have Pastor Wayne and Tara Kuba joining us. And I don't know if y'all have been able to watch the news. I know we are coming out of a terrible storm and a lot of us didn't have power. So maybe you haven't been able to see the news, but there's been a lot happening in the world, particularly in Myanmar or Burma. There's been a lot of turmoil and a lot of disaster really happening over there. And if you don't know this, I know I'm new to this group, so I am still learning all of these things, but we have quite a few Burmese people in San Antonio and at our church. And so this is really hitting home for us in a way that we might not even be aware of. And so we have Wayne and Tara joining us, and we are so excited to dig into this. And we're just going to unpack what's happening in Burma. We're going to talk about what it means for us as people of faith when there's crises in other nations. And so we can go ahead and get started. So welcome, Tara and Wayne. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Yes, glad to be here too.
Awesome. Could y'all just give us a breakdown? I know some of us know more than others. I'm still learning about Myanmar and about, everything. Could you give us a breakdown of what exactly is happening? I know we had the prayer service the other day, which helped me understand a little bit, but could y'all give us a breakdown of the situation and what's happening over there?
Well, it's a long and varied history for the people of Burma. Back prior to the colonial period in Southeast Asia, about 200 years ago, before the British came in and the French and the Spanish and made colonies out of all of these countries. They were independent nations, had their own kingdoms, their own royalty, all of that. And then in the early 1800s, with the colonial development, the French, even the Germans, British began to set up colonies. And England had the best position in that it already had India as part of its territory. And so they moved east from India. And even while Adoniram Judson, our missionary, was there, he was in prison for a while because he was white and because the people of Burma were battling the British coming in to try to conquer them. Well, the British won that. And then so for a couple of hundred years, 150 years, the Burma was essentially a colony of Great Britain. And then during World War II, the Japanese conquered it. And after the Japanese lost World War II, the United Nations decided that, and Great Britain agreed that Burma should have its own independence. And so they were several of the ethnic groups, the Karen, especially the Kachin, the Shan, were promised their own at least semi-autonomous territory when Burma became independent. Well, that didn't happen. And so for ever since then, the Burmese and the Kachin have been battling to establish their own territory. And when the democratically set up government by the British was taken over, there was conflict. Communism was trying to get a foothold in Burma as well, and several other powers were trying to take hold. Democracy was set up, but it soon fell under the influence of the military. And so for 60 years, the military ruled Burma up until about 10 years ago. And there were at least two major attempts by the people to establish democracy, and both were crushed ruthlessly by the military. In addition, the military continued to invade and destroy villages in the eastern part of the country, in particular, driving out thousands of Karen people from their villages. Same thing with the Kachin. And that set up the refugees that ended up in Thailand. in the western part of the country, in Chin State, many of the Chin became Christians during the 18 and 1900s. And so they were just basically neglected. And the military, over the 60 or so years that they ruled, they isolated the country. In 1980s, a tsunami, a hurricane came, a cyclone, and killed 250,000 people. And the Burmese government refused any outside assistance for that event. So this kind of laid the foundation. And in about 2010, the military decided to loosen up the country and established a constitution and set up a democratic process. However, the Constitution still skewed the government in the favor of military. They were guaranteed 25% of the seats in the houses of governing parliament. And then with the first general election, Aung San Suu Kyi's Democratic Party won easily. They set up the government, and then they had their next election in November of this past year. And again, they won tremendous, 83% of the popular vote went to the Democratic organization. And about that time, the military saw that they were losing power. Some of the military generals had been brought up with questions about how they had handled the Rohingya Muslim problems, and were possibly facing charges at the International Court of Justice. And so there were several political things involved. The Chinese were losing influence as the democracy developed. And so February 1st, they decided to put an end to it, and rolled back in with their armored vehicles, and took control of the government and imprisoned all of the Democratic leaders. And 3 weeks ago, they took over the government. So that's kind of where we are now. The people with the taste of democracy are not lying down for this. They're standing strong and firm, hoping or praying that we can reestablish a democratic government in Myanmar.
Yeah. Oh my. So yeah. So many of those people, and that's not long. Only 10 years to have had that taste of democracy. And so yeah, so many of them know what it's like prior to it. And so absolutely, that's really helpful to have that history, Wayne. Thank you. Tara, do you have anything to add to that about your understanding of everything going on?
I'm so impressed that Pastor Wayne could tell a lot of Burma, the history of Burma. But for me, even though I live and grew up in Burma, and I left the country since 2004, and I got lost of what was happening. But he gave a very impact information about Burma. So I don't need to say a lot, but Burma gained independence from Britain in 1948, and but it was ruled by the armed forces from 1962. It was General Ne Win, so we were under his, I would say, socialism. Under socialism, then into 1988, we were in a military dictatorship. So it's the same rulers and the same of their military dictatorships, and then this has happened again. So I would say country has been in the military dictatorship for 3 generations.
Wow. And so you left in 2004. So you left before the Democratic government was, because that was in 2012, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
So in my life, I've never have been chance or have voted. So
Yeah,
I haven't had that chance.
yeah,
But these youth and the young people have chance, and we thought that they are going towards their democratic directions.
yeah.
But right now it was crash again, so it's very um, sad
Mhm.
for the people of
Let me just make one more thing regarding the economy. Uh, Burma is very, very rich in natural resources, uh, oil, teak, rice, farming ability, just lots of very, uh, very valuable natural resources. And as the world was looking at Southeast Asia right after World War II, it was considered that Burma would probably be the diamond of Southeast Asia with its natural resources. Well, the military put an end to that. They aligned with the communists in China for a large part. And so China has spent the last 50 or 60 years uh, plundering Burma's resources through the help of the military and buying them on pennies on the dollar of their market value. And so Burma became one of the poorest nations in the world as a result of their isolation and the stripping of their economy by foreign nations. And so that's the biggest thing I saw coming out of this 10 years of democracy is the economic development. Uh, at one time, Burma and, for instance, Singapore were on the same economic level. Without democracy and in Burma and the military government, they are now a poor third world country, while Singapore prospers economically. So, that's just the impact of people who keep the country subdued for their own personal gain. So that's one of the biggest things that I observe with this military taking back over. It's plunged the country again back into economic depression.
Okay. So a lot of this, and it sounds like what y'all are both saying, is that it feels disturbingly familiar um, as how things were going before the democracy in 2012, right? This feels, you said it's a lot of the same leaders, it's a lot of the same actions that we're seeing. So um, that's helpful to put that all into context. And I know for me, when I see these things in the news, because it feels like there's always something, whether it's Burma or somewhere else, right? It feels like there's always a nation in turmoil, and it feels overwhelming to me, especially as someone halfway across the world, um, to know what to do about that, to know if there is anything to do about that, right? And it's easy for us to kind of, as Americans at least, to check out and say, well, that's unfortunate. I'll be praying for them, but it's easy to feel like there's nothing we can do. And so that's what I'm hoping today we can at least unpack this a little bit and talk through how, as people of faith, we can respond to that. Because I believe, especially as people of faith, we have things we can do, right?
Can I say something?
Yeah.
I wanted to say that sometimes people ask me why we use Burma, and legally the country has named to Myanmar. But for me personally, that was named by the military government. So I still calling Burma. And I remember Aung San Suu Kyi also when he went to Britain, and people ask her, and she's also said doesn't matter which name you use. So um, I in 1989, um, the military dictatorship, they changed the name from Burma to Myanmar. So when you look at the map in the news, you will see Myanmar, but we still call it Burma. I think that would be okay.
Yeah, no, that's something I meant to ask y'all even before this was what is the preference there? I know people kind of use them interchangeably, but that's helpful, right? Because the language we use there, there's meaning behind that, even if we don't know it. So that's helpful. So you and I would assume that most of the other Burmese people here are of that same opinion that Burma is what uh, they would like to call their nation, correct? Okay, that's helpful. I know for me, I'm still learning a lot of these things, so I don't know a lot of the history, but that's really good, Tara. Thank you for saying that. So, and I'm assuming that, I mean, I would assume this, but I'm assuming that Christians are the religious minority in Burma. Could you give us a little bit of a picture of the religious landscape in Burma? What faiths are represented there, and kind of what is the dominant faith there?
Okay. The dominant large majority is Buddhist. The country is about 85% Buddhist. Next largest group is Christians at about 6 or 7%, and then followed by Islam, about 4%, and then other world religions behind that. Most of the Christians are in the Chin, Kachin, and Karen tribes. So that's there's been some struggle in Myanmar regarding the Muslims, the Islam. They are the third group behind Buddhist and Christianity, and they have been persecuted, and during the last 10 years, they have received persecution, and the Christians have been exempt. The Buddhists and the Muslims are fighting, and the Christians are kind of on the sideline in that. During the democratic time, the Christians just blossomed in terms of ministries and things they could do because they had the freedom. And we had the freedom as Americans to go over there and provide teaching. Even though, for instance, the Karen have had their own national organization for over 150 years, they still lack in their seminaries even master's and doctorate level teaching material in Burmese or in Karen. And so they are hungry, starving for the ability to speak English and to hear English-born speakers come and teach them. And so that would greatly enhance their ability to develop leadership as they know and understand English better. So from a religion standpoint, Buddhists are far in the majority, and their religion is state supported by the government. And the Christians basically are there supported by the Lord and Christians around the world.
Yeah. Okay. So, and that's interesting that the Muslim population you're saying is probably experiencing the most oppression there. And that's not necessarily something I would have assumed. So do y'all, I don't know how connected y'all are with people over there right now. How do you think, and I know you said Christianity blossomed during this time of democracy. How do you think what we're going through right now in Burma, how is that going to impact Christians specifically and Muslims as well? What are we seeing over there?
I want to say that where I came from.
Just a little bit, Tara.
Okay.
There you go.
For me, I came from a Christian family, and I grew up in the city. So as Pastor Wayne mentioned that the Christian populations are maybe 6, 7, maybe I think less than 10%. So not many compared with the Buddhists, less. But the Christian's faith is very strong. The Baptist is pretty strong, and also I would say all the Christians, religious, the Catholic, Methodist, or Presbyterian, and the denominations, they work very closely inside Burma. So when I grew up in Mandalay, we used to have their ecumenical movements and prayer. And I remember when 1988, when their protest started, then the Christians also, they said we should express, our voice and to the nations as well, even though we are stand as a Christian, as a ministers, or different religious, but they think this is a nation's wide problem. So this time, I will say many Christians, different ethnic groups also came out, and they also involved in the protest. I have a contact with my friends, and she mentioned one thing, that the conventional level, they released a letter that the Christians not to get involved, but some of the people, they think that this is we are, as a people of Burma, and as a nation, the nationwide people are shouting, and it's the young people are on the street. We should involved as well. So even though they were told by their not to get involved too much in their politics, but right now I will say many Christians, many ethnic groups, they also come out and they will express in their voices as well.
Yeah. Okay, so that's wonderful. So the Christians, they're taking an active role in all of these things. Okay, that's great. And so, but it does sound like there's going to, especially as far as Christian education goes and those things, that's something that might be, if that was blossoming during democracy, I can only imagine that would be more difficult now, as far as Christian education and the expansion of the church. So that's something to be praying for sure.
But for Burma, sometimes you have to look at from people who live in the city and people who live in the village. The life is very, very, I would say, different. And the government also always, even though they say we have the freedom of speech, freedom of religious, but actually there is no freedom in their village. They don't want to show that part, but I would say the Korean, or right now the Chin or the Korani, that who are in United States, they came as a refugee, and then they have more stories that to tell, because they experience that, they have to face that persecutions. So I will say that I did not come from that perspective, but they have that, so they can tell you better pictures and better understanding of that, what's the religious freedom in Burma.
Yeah, well, and that's helpful to remember. And we know this in our country here, but it's easy to forget that that religious experience is not a monolith, even among people of faith, right? In other countries, people are going to experience things totally differently, like you said, in the city versus the village. And so that's important to keep in mind too, right? That they're getting really different experiences even even now. Thank you for mentioning that. Sorry, Wayne, I muted you because I was getting some echo, but you can unmute yourself now. And so this is something that I learned when I was moving here, that we had a pretty big Burmese population that had come to San Antonio. And so, and specifically here at FBCSA, we have several Burmese congregations, right? And so, and my first time being with y'all was on Sunday at the prayer service, and I didn't realize how many, and I'm sure that wasn't even everyone, how many Burmese people we had in our church, and that's just wonderful. And could y'all help me understand? So there are several people groups represented here at FBCSA, right? Could you just, I mean, the people listening to this might already know this, but for my sake, could you give us a breakdown of the people groups that are represented here at the church? When you can, yeah.
Okay. We basically have four groups, four different churches. The Korean, San Antonio Korean Baptist Church represents the Korean group. Their native language, their language they worship in is Korean. And then the next group, there's a little bit of, there's two Chin groups actually. There's a 50 or 60 different Chin ethnic groups, and we have Timothy's group, the Gospel Myanmar Church. He worships in Burmese rather than in the native language of the Chin tribes. He wants to be more inclusive. That's why he's used the name of Myanmar in his group. He is trying to be a worship for any of the people of Myanmar who would like to come and share, because they worship in Burmese and focus on the general Chin culture rather than the specific Chin ethnic group of which they are a part. The other Chin group is the Zomi. They're Zomi Chin. They're a large group that has their own national convention in the Chin state. They're on the western side of Burma, and so they speak Zomi in their worship. And then, even here in San Antonio, there's another Chin group, the Harkar Chin group, that worship at the Alamo city at Alamo Baptist Church over. And so there's several different Chin groups, but we have the Zomi Chin and then the Myanmar Chin group that is being more inclusive and worships in Burmese. And then the fourth group is the Karenni group. The Karenni are the mountain people in the eastern part. They have received the gospel much more recently than the others. So they are less experienced in doing church, and yet we here in San Antonio have the opportunity to be a real force for them, organizing their national convention here in the U.S. The Karen have a strong national convention in the U.S. The Zomi also have a strong national convention here in the U.S. And so we basically see four groups: Karen, Burmese, Chin, Zomi, and the Karenni.
Okay.
And just it was a phenomenon to me that all of these groups have their own culture, their own color, their own alphabet, their own language, and one cannot communicate with the other.
Really? Okay.
Yes.
Oh my, I had no idea. Okay. That's helpful for me to understand. I didn't realize how diverse of a group we had, even all just from Burma. Okay, so do they all speak Burmese as well as their native language to their people group, or is that?
No, as best I can determine, about 80% of them speak Burmese. If they went to school in Burma, they speak Burmese. If they're from the jungles, the older people do not. They speak only their own native language.
Okay. Oh my goodness, that's helpful. When I was there at the service, and I was like, oh, there's so many different people groups, but I had no idea how to parse them all out. So that's helpful. Okay, so that's helpful too if we're thinking about all of these people have come specifically to San Antonio and specifically to our church. They come from really diverse backgrounds in Burma. Either of you, how have you seen the people here respond? How do you, if you could give like an explanation of how they're feeling, how they're wanting to respond to the things happening in Burma, what is kind of on their hearts right now?
I would say they're very positive.
You speak up just a little bit again, sorry.
Oh,
There you go.
I will say they are very positive and they are very supportive, and they love. I could see that they love the country and they care about the people in Burma. Most of them, including me, I still have families and friends behind. So my heart is the same, that what's happening in Burma, it's not acceptable. And if I am in Burma right now, I will be protesting. I will be on the streets with them too. But we have to remember, people who comes to the United States, they came here as a refugee. So one way or another, they relate with some of the government, because oppressions, because of the persecutions, and there is no place, no land for them to live, and then they have to live in the refugee camp for many years, and finally came to the United States and went to their different countries. So some of them have very trauma about the persecution, and then how the military treated them crucially, violently. So that trauma is, right now I don't know how big will be like, and especially the Korean people. But last Sunday, I would say that my friends, the Zomi friends, and then the Burmese folks and Karenni, they came, and then they want their people of Burma to see that we are praying for you, and we are feeling, and we know that how I would say angry you are, how we're grieving with them. So this is what we will do. And then maybe this last Sunday, the prayer may not be the first and the last. I think as long as it's continued, then we will also support, and we will have the prayer. And what else we can do? If we need to support through some financial support, then we may need to do that. Then we will do that as well. And I think they are very, very much caring and very concerned for the people in Burma.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's encouraging too, that there's a sense of unity between the people here of the different people groups, but also with those in Burma. That's encouraging, even though I know it's a tumultuous situation. That's encouraging.
Yes, right now the protest is there nationwide, and not only the Burmese people. If you are living in the Kachin state, you will see Kachin people came out. If you're living in the Karen state, you will see the Karen people, Chin people. I would say any ethnic groups are protesting, and they don't want this military coup at all, and they condemned, and they opposed, and they want the democracy. So we feel the same with them as well.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you brought up that this is, revisiting some trauma that so many of the people here in the US have gone through, right? And I can only imagine, not that long ago, so many of them had experienced these things, and then to see this on the news and to know people that are there experiencing the same thing. Like you said, we don't know the full impact of that right now, but that's something that we've talked about at midweek last semester, and something we'll actually talk about next month too, is just the impact of trauma, right? And so sometimes we forget that that happens on a global scale, right? And that's not just something in our own personal lives, but that's something that can happen at a national level. So that's important to remember. Thank you for sharing that. So how can we as people of faith, especially those of us that that are not Burmese or that are new to this situation, how can people of faith here support and love and care for the Burmese people, especially right now, those that are stateside and those that are overseas in Burma? What would you say to those people?
I want to say thank you to our pastors, First Baptist Church senior pastors, Pastor Chris Johnson and other associate pastors, including you. And when we write a letter to their president, Joe Biden, and then you all came up and say that we will sign and we will support it. This is very helpful for us. And this is another voice that we can express, and we can tell our people that it's not only us, the world, the people surrounding us also care about us, care about you. So I want to really appreciate for the church support, and definitely prayer. They need prayer, and inside Burma, the Christians and the other religious also right now, they send out, especially I got letters from my friends, and then they always sending out, and then they will have their prayer, fasting, the fasting and prayer all the time. And so when I talked to them, they also said, pray for us. We know that God's will walking among their hearts and then among them, because they were saying what's happened in 1988 and right now they said looks different. There are some similarities, but difference means in last time it was very violent, and then people started feedback, give their feedback, fight back, and then the military could say that, hey, we cannot control it anymore, so they took power, and then that voices were disappear, gone for many years, for more than 20 years. So this time they said we do not want that happens again like that. This time is they were protested peacefully, and they said that protesting peacefully also, they feel that many people are praying for them. And very important not to show your anger, not to respond it in wherever the government, the military could attacked to you directly. Don't do that again. Don't do it. Do not show your anger. So that is very important for them right now. So our prayer should be that to show the love, to show the kindness, to show be patient, to be patient. So I will like to request when you pray that people to be patient for that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's helpful to know. Yeah, exactly what to pray for, because it can feel overwhelming, especially when we don't know, individuals over there, like y'all do. That's extremely helpful. And for those listening, Tara and Wayne, they put together, along with the Burmese people, a letter to President Biden that the staff was able to sign. And so I'm glad that y'all were able to do that as well, because I think prayer and civic engagement, right? We can do both of those things. And both of those things are so important. Wayne, do you have anything to add to
Yeah, from a little bit different perspective, the political impact that this coup will have on the national security of the United States has probably been underplayed. For several years, and particularly under the administration of the previous president, we were building a strong wall around Communist China in their efforts to infiltrate Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Burma. And it's kind of like the fence has been breached because they have strong influence with the Burmese military. And so, from a political standpoint, if you want to make your voice known, let the president know that you are supporting containment of the Chinese expansion into South Asia. And that would be the biggest leverage that you would have as an American citizen, uh, because the United States government responds when national security is at risk. And I believe with the Chinese, our national security is at risk. And if we can rebuild that, plug up that hole in the wall around China, that we can, it would be to not only America's benefits, but extraordinarily to the people of Burma. Because if they can become economically strong, then they can keep China at bay.
Yeah, absolutely. I would have never thought about the implication for us here at home. Those of us that aren't Burmese, that's really helpful. That's insightful to think of it that way. Absolutely. And that's something that we have power over, that we can communicate those things to our leaders. Absolutely. Well, that's really helpful. And we'll hopefully as a group, especially during our time of Q&A later, we can talk through some ways that we can do this together too. And that this isn't just kind of a one-time conversation, but that the March for Justice and all of these things in Burma, it takes a lot of time. And so we want y'all to know that we're in this for the long haul with you, but we'll talk through ways that we can maintain our support, beyond just the Sunday prayer service and this conversation. But those things are really helpful to have practical ways to do that. Something that we've talked a lot about last semester is this idea of being a good neighbor. And we talk about this all the time at church, right? We're supposed to be a good neighbor. It's in the Bible. But we don't always know what that means. And we had a conversation about racial inequity last semester, especially when it comes to Black Americans. And we had a guest speaker that said, and he put it this way, that it's not just to love your neighbor, but to actively seek the life of your neighbor, right? And that might mean something different, right? To be called to seek the life of our neighbor. And it's hard for us to understand how to kind of, we understand that, well, the people in my church are my neighbor, or the people that I live by are my neighbor, or, the people I work with are my neighbor, but it's hard to extrapolate that to a global scale, right? To say the people of Myanmar are my neighbor, or of Burma are my neighbor. We don't always think that way. What would it look like for us to love our neighbor on the global scale? What would that mean for us to do? I know it's kind of a big question. I don't know the answer to that, but if y'all have any thoughts on that.
Well, certainly we would want to keep them high on our prayer list. Another thing is just involvement, awareness. Know what's going on in the world. Sometimes you kind of have to seek out that information. I don't hear much about Myanmar on the 5:30 national news. Once in a while it's mentioned, but you need to dig that out and know, not only in the case of Myanmar, but with the warlords in Africa and Somalia. There's all of those places, even where the people, selfish people of power, try to subdue the rights of the people, of the human rights of the people. So we need to keep that in mind, be that on our prayer list, and be aware of it, and not only find out what's going on in Southeast Asia, but around the world, in other places in our world where we can have influence.
Absolutely. That's something that y'all talked a little bit about at the Sunday service. We know that, and we say this a lot as Christians, right? We know that the things we experience here it's spiritual warfare, right? It's not just human against human, right? But sometimes I forget about that when it comes to things happening on the global scale, right? I don't have that viewpoint all the time. But like you said, this isn't necessarily unique to Burma, right? This is happening in nations across the world. And right now it's kind of happening in a concentrated way in Burma, but like you said, in Somalia and other nations, this is happening too. And so we have to remember that this is spiritual, right? And that we have spiritual authority when we pray. That's important because I think that helps it feel less overwhelming, when we're thinking through what can we even do, for people that are halfway across the world. Prayer is really important. So absolutely. Tara, do you have anything else to add or anything?
I would say most of the Christians in Burma, they view the United States a Christian nation, and also we have that because of the Adenine Judson, and we got to see faith and loving people, and also we are saved. We got the good news, I would say, and so the Burma and United States have a long relationship, even there 200 more than 200 years. So I believe and I know that many churches in US, when your neighbor, I'm talking about neighbor right now, currently the situations in Burma, it's very violent and very scary. And we believe and we hope that many Christians and many churches in the US also praying for us, and they're hearing that people crying out, the voices that people crying out, and when we know is very encouraging for them, and so we want their nations to know that we are not alone, and our friends are praying for you, and our friends are ready to support, and our friends are behind you. So that is very encouraging for them. So I just want to tell our friends here in US, and please pray for them, and also wherever you can do, please do, and maybe even writing a letter to the president, or you just support by their by finance, or many ways. What I'm saying is many ways, and the same thing that we want to express our love and our care to the other nations as well. I understand Burma is not the only country that having critical situations, but there might be other somewhere, or other countries may have the same things too, similar situations too. So we should care about them. At least we can pray for them. Then it will be very encouraging for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, I mean, y'all really even answered our last question too, thinking through how it's at least for me, I'll speak for myself, that it feels overwhelming to know what to do, or to know where to start when it comes to responding to things happening in other nations. But this has all been really helpful. I mean, these are practical things, right? We know that prayer is important, but we also know that there's things that we can do. We can write to our leaders in our nation. We can send financial support. And so I think hopefully this conversation has helped our people feel like there's some kind of tangible things that they can walk away with to be able to help both Burma and the nations around the world that are experiencing similar things. And so, do y'all have any final thoughts? I know we're nearing the end of our time, and I'm appreciative that y'all were willing to do this. Do y'all have any final thoughts or anything that that you want to add?
I will like to say that last Sunday we had unity prayer for Burma, and that was the first time that we had together and praying for Burma. And I think as long as this events going on, and then we also may not be end, we will like to continue. And when we have a prayer like that, we would like to ask church families and friends to support, and then to come and join with us. And I would like to invite them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And-
And hopefully this helps
Yeah.
you feel welcome into the circle.
And-
Not intimidated.
Yeah, from my perspective, I'm looking forward to the Q&A time. I plan to be there with you for that, and so we'll save the rest of our time for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and so as always, y'all, we'll jump on Zoom now for Q&A, and Wayne is going to join us for that. And so we are super excited. So, I know this hopefully sparked a lot of questions or a lot of thoughts for you. And so go ahead and click the Zoom link, and we will be there for Q&A. So thank you, Wayne and Tara, so much for joining us this week. We appreciate it. Awesome.
Thank you.
All right, well then we will
Thank you.
see y'all on Zoom. Okay, and then let me